The subject of the next three discussions is the recent history of our own species. So we're looking at Homo sapiens. Now, during the phylogeny section, we talked about how we can use lots of data to help us understand relationships amongst organisms. When we have fossil data, in addition to telling us about how those organisms are related to other species, they can also tell us a lot of other things. And with some of our most recent relatives, there is additional available data. So DNA evidence usually disappears fairly rapidly when you're looking at a geological time scale. It can hang around for a very, very long time under the correct conditions. But we're talking tens of thousands, maybe pushing into the hundreds of thousands if conditions are just right. So because some of our close relatives, such as Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthals as we have pictured here, this is a reconstruction, are fairly recently extinct, again on the tens of thousands of years time scale. In some cases, we are able to extract DNA from preserved samples. So they are possible, and sometimes it's degraded, limited, you have to take multiple samples, it's tricky to work with, but it can be done. So here is an image, a diagram of a researcher who is collecting samples for DNA analysis. Now, with any ancient DNA, it's important not to contaminate it, but this is particularly true when we're working with the DNA of very close relatives, because it's that much harder for us to distinguish human contaminating DNA that we're always shedding, right? Skin cells, sneezing, any sort of bit of the researcher that was contaminating the sample would make it very, very difficult to do. So this researcher is in this kind of hazmat suit, not to protect herself from danger, but to keep from contaminating the samples with which she's working. So we do have DNA evidence from some of these more recently extinct close human relatives. Now, as we talk about primates and our close human relatives, we're going to need to be very clear and careful about the terminology. And there's a lot of it that's very similar, so I'm just going to be very clear, and we're going to simplify somewhat as we do this. Okay, so the larger mammal group to which humans belong are the primates. Okay, so just know that. Primates include lemurs, old world monkeys, new world monkeys, and then what we typically call the great apes. Now, within the primates, the family that we belong to is hominids, or if you want the technical term, it's hominidae. It's kind of tricky to say some of these words. I'll change this, but we'll use the term hominids. That's more of the kind of general term, but this is the scientific name for the family. Families of animals end in I-D-A-E, hominidae. Sorry, it's hard to pronounce this. Lots of similar syllables in that, okay? But that's the family, and we'll be referring to it as the hominids with a D on the end, right? That's going to be the group, and you need to know that, okay? Now, notice that I think it was almost a cruel joke for the people, the taxonomists, that first named our own group of primates. So our genus is Homo. We are Homo sapiens. Now, just a quick word about that term. Sometimes people will use the term human, and they'll use it to mean various things. So in some cases, you'll see people using the term human to mean any member of the genus Homo, including Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis. There are a bunch of species that are similar enough to ourselves that they've been classified into our same genus. I don't like that usage, but I just want you to be aware of it if you might see it in other places. So when I say human, I'm going to be referring more narrowly to our own species, Homo sapiens. That's just the way I was taught, and it's useful, but there is not complete consensus on that. So again, if I say human, in your head you should say Homo sapiens, but realize that there are other close relatives also. So notice the taxonomy here as we move up from genus. So Homo, hominina, hominini, homininae, hominidae, homininoidea. So again, it's like a cruel joke, right? Now, we don't need to know this detail and this level. So I'm going to have you learn basically three taxonomic names leading to our own lineage, and then we're going to look at some species also that are amongst this group of the close relatives, the other hominins, okay? So The first one we've already talked about. We'll bring them all up here. The hominids with a D, right? The hominids, the family, originated about 14 million years ago as a recognizable group separate from the other primates. So 14 million years ago for the hominid, right, with a D at the end. And the hominids include humans, chimpanzee, and there's actually another species closely related called Paranthropus or the bonobo, a couple species of gorilla, and then 3 species, I think it is, depending on who you talk to, but a few species of orangutan. And all of those are the hominids. There are a bunch of extinct ones also, including some close relatives that we're going to be talking about the fossil evidence for. Okay, so you should know hominid, 14 million years ago, us, the close relatives to ourselves, and the great apes. The next one that I want you to know is the tribe. Sorry, the subtribe is the one we're going to be talking about. But for simplicity's sake, and because it's so similar, we'll just refer to it as hominin with an N on the end. So the hominins is us and our very close extinct relatives. And again, we'll give you some more details about these. So we broke off from the other hominids, the great apes, about 5.5 million years ago. Now at that time, humans, Homo sapiens as we know it, did not exist. We had ancestors that were around, and we'll look at some of those. And eventually there was diversification, evolution. The reading for today, paper number 7, I believe it is, the Foley paper, goes into a little bit more detail about some of the patterns that are observed there and some of the things that make us uniquely human. So take a look at that and review some of those things. Okay, so just again, I know this is redundant, but it's important. Hominid, 14 million years ago, us, the great apes, and our close extinct relatives. Hominin, about 5.5 million years ago, is when we split off from the other great apes. And that also includes our extinct relatives we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so hominin, hominid, go over those. Now, there is a rich and fairly abundant fossil record for the hominins, us and our close extinct relatives. Our species, Homo sapiens, is the only extant, the only living species of hominin. All the rest are gone, but there were many, many of them. Some of this is because we're a little self-interested, so we look and spend more time and energy and resources looking for these relatives. So this is probably not that different from many, many groups of species that would have lots of extinct relatives if we could find and spend enough time looking for their fossils. But we've put the energy and the effort into looking for our close relatives. Many of these are known from only a small sample, enough to say that it's something different, it's a new species. Others are known from much more complete and extensive records. Now, the main feature that defines and separates hominins from the rest of the primates is true bipedalism, which again, if you recall when we talked about the birds, is a transition from 4 limbs to moving around on only 2 limbs, and most commonly the hind limbs, which is what happened in humans and our close relatives. Okay, so if you look at a chimpanzee, they can walk on 2 legs, but it's awkward for them and they are not very efficient at it. Same thing with gorillas, orangutans, all the same. But humans are the opposite, right? We get around very easily on 2 legs. If we have to go on 4, it's awkward and uncomfortable and we can't do very quickly. So bipedalism is by far the best, simplest characteristic, although there are others that vary somewhat across these different groups. Now, I'm not going to have you spend time memorizing and learning much of the diversity of this group or even learning about what's related to what, but we're going to look at 3 main divisions. An early one, Australopithecus, kind of a mid-range one, almost like you'd think of a side evolutionary experiment that eventually left behind no descendants. And then more recently, our own genus. So we will look at that. About 3.2 million years ago, there was a species living on Earth that we have named Australopithecus afarensis. The most famous representative fossil sample of this species was a subadult female that has been nicknamed Lucy. So if you've heard that before, you may be familiar with that. She is from the species Australopithecus afarensis. She was a very complete specimen, and there were many other specimens found also. So we know quite a bit about Australopithecus afarensis. The name literally means the southern ape from Africa. And again, ape is a little bit of a relative term. This is a lineage that are more close related to modern humans than they are to the other hominid species. Okay, but they occurred across much of Central Africa about 3.2 million years ago, and there is some good, strong evidence that they had developed fairly primitive, but still stone tools. So maybe like a hand axe or a rock that's used for crushing, that they were changing and modifying. They weren't just picking up rocks and using them. They were purposely modifying them for use, but fairly simple, nothing like on the terms of a spearhead or an arrowhead. Okay. Beginning about 3 million years ago and extending for about 1.5 million years of history, there was a large group called Paranthropus. We're not going to learn any species in particular, but there are a couple that are pictured here. These were very diverse. They seemed to do very, very well for a time. But again, they were quite different and were almost like a side experiment in the hominin lineages. They had these large crests along the top of their skull. It's sometimes called a cranial keel or cranial crest. These were used for muscle attachments for their very large jaws. So they probably were using their jaws to process very hard food, had very strong jaws, and could do that. And they look quite different in many respects from the lineage that eventually led to modern humans. So although these are fairly closely related to modern humans, they aren't on our direct lineage and were a side experiment. So just know them and kind of know that very general detail. But along the lineage leading to modern humans, we have one other major group that we need to talk about, which is our own genus. And that is genus Homo. Homo is Greek for the same or similar, right? And so these are organisms that are similar enough to ourselves that we place them within our own genus. And Homo erectus is perhaps the most famous of these, but there's a variety of them. Only a couple are pictured here. You don't need to know all of them, just know that there are quite a few of them. And they extend from about 2.5, maybe going back a little farther than that, but about 2.5 million years ago, and of course up all the way to today. Our own species is the only living remnant of this once much more diverse group. And there's evidence that many of these lived at the same time as one another. So there wasn't just one single species that changed and then became this one and then became this one and then became modern humans. There was some overlap and some changes that occurred along different lineages that didn't occur in others. Again, the paper does a little bit of a job explaining that mechanism and some of those patterns. Now, all of these groups that we've been talking about of the including most of the hominids, right? Most of the great apes, the orangutans are a little bit of an exception. They migrated out of Africa. But most of the great apes and all of the early hominins that we just talked about, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and all of our early Homo, in the same genus as Homo, were all found in Africa. So it's very, very clear that this lineage is primarily, and the ones leading to modern humans, originated and evolved for millions of years in Africa. About 2 million years ago, maybe a little bit less, there is good evidence that Homo erectus migrated out of Africa. So the genus Homo quite extensively establishes many new populations across the old world and perhaps even down into Southeast Asia. Okay, but again, at that time, it was not modern humans. They were anatomically very different, and so we classify them as Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, which is found on the small islands here in the Sulawesi. Anyway, different species and some overlap, but these really were the first hominins to move out of Africa. We have very good evidence that they had much more complex stone tools and circumstantial evidence that they were by this time using fire also as a tool. Okay, so familiarize yourself with that. Just remember that they expanded out of Africa and established new populations in the old world about 2 million years ago.